Some stories don't begin with a scream, but with a whisper, a muffled cry, beneath whiskey-soaked floorboards, lost in silence. And sometimes, one man chooses to hear it. He didn't just pull her from the darkness, he set something in motion that Dustvale would never forget. But the real question is, who did she become? Stay with us. Her story will stay with you. Chapter 1. The Sound Beneath the Floorboards. They say Dustvale is a town the wind never quite leaves. That night, it howled low through the crooked fences and cracked windows, rattling shutters like brittle bones and whispering old sins through the dry grass. Sheriff Cole had no business being out in that weather. His coat was soaked from a rain that barely fell, just mist and dust mixed together like memory and regret. But he had trouble sleeping when the wind picked up, and the saloon's dull piano and warm whiskey always helped settle his nerves. The place was mostly empty, save for 2 ranch hands half asleep at the bar, and the barkeep polishing the same glass for the 3rd time that hour. The piano played itself, a broken melody, uneven and tired, like it had forgotten how to sing. Cole didn't plan on staying long, just a drink and maybe a few minutes to clear the dust from his thoughts. Then he heard it. Not clearly, not enough for a man to swear by, but just enough to stop him midst a sound beneath the music, beneath the hum of low voices, beneath the earth itself. A cry, soft, buried. He froze, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat. The barkeep glanced up but said nothing. Cole tilted his head like a hound catching a scent, and stepped slowly toward the back hallway. Each floorboard creaked like it didn't want to be walked on, and the air grew heavier with each step, not with smoke or sweat, but with something colder, older. The basement door was half hidden behind crates and broken chairs. No one had touched it in years, by the look of it. He knelt, pressing his ear to the wood, and heard it again. A stifled sob, raw and wet, like a throat worn thin by silence. That was no imagination. That was pain. He didn't ask permission. He didn't call for help. He just pulled the revolver from his hip, gripped the rusted handle, and yanked the door open. The stairs groaned under his boots as he descended, lantern in one hand, gun in the other. The light flickered against stone walls, revealing crates, cobwebs, and the outline of a figure slumped in the far corner. She didn't look up. Her hair hung in matted ropes over her face, and her dress, or what remained of it, was torn and stained with more than just dirt. But it was the chains that stopped his breath. Rusty iron cuffs around her ankles. A lock, a bowl of water, long dried, a bucket in the corner, a life buried. And then she looked up, and he would never forget those eyes, not for the rest of his life, not even if he lived to be 100 and died with dust in his lungs. Chapter 2. Eyes in the Dark. The basement air was thick with years of rot, and when Sheriff Cole stepped inside, the lantern's flickering light didn't chase away the darkness, it only carved out pockets of it. Like memories hiding in corners, the smell hit him first, the kind that stayed on your coat long after you left. The bitter mix of sweat, fear, and old earth, damp and disturbed. It wasn't the kind of place built for keeping secrets. It was the kind that swallowed them whole. She was there, barely a shape at first, slumped against the stone wall like someone poured out of a bottle and left to dry. Chains rattled softly when she stirred, and even that sound was careful, like it had learned not to make too much noise. Her arms were folded tight over her chest, knees pulled in, as if she could shrink her body small enough to disappear. Cole didn't speak, didn't ask. He just watched. And when she finally looked up, the world narrowed to the space between them. Her face was swollen, bruises blooming across her cheek and jaw like wild violets in spring mud. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth, and one eye was almost closed, the skin around it too swollen to blink. But the other eye, God, that other eye was open wide, not in fear or rage, but in the raw disbelief of someone who'd stopped hoping long ago and suddenly didn't know what to do with hope's return. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she didn't even flinch. She just stared, like he was something impossible. Like rescue was something only children believed in. And Cole, rooted in place by that look, realized he had found not just a woman in chains, but a silence so heavy it pressed down on every breath. It wasn't just what had been done to her. It was how long it had been happening without a soul bothering to notice. He took a slow step forward, the lantern casting her face in trembling light, revealing more than bruises, revealing time itself, carved into her features like wind against canyon walls. A thin cut ran down from her temple, dried and jagged, and her collarbone jutted like something half-starved. She looked like she had lived through winter without the benefit of snow. Cole knelt down, slow and unthreatening, the way you might approach a wounded animal with more pride than strength left. He placed the lantern gently on the dirt floor and let the light spill between them, neither bright nor warm, but enough to be seen. She shifted slightly, her wrists trembling as she tried to sit straighter. But the motion made the iron cuffs clink again, and she stopped, as if punished by their sound alone. There was dried blood under her nails and rope burn around her ankles, and even in stillness, she seemed constantly braced for the next blow. But Cole said nothing. His voice had no place here, not yet. Instead, he reached into his coat, slowly, and pulled out a flask of water. He uncapped it and set it down, an offering, a gesture. She stared at it for a long time, her expression unreadable, and for a moment he thought she might turn her face away and vanish back into the dark. But then, with the slowest, most deliberate movement he had ever seen, she reached out and curled her fingers around the tin. Her hands were trembling so hard that water sloshed over the edge as she lifted it to her lips. But she drank anyway, eyes never leaving his. It was the kind of stare that left something behind, something invisible but real, a shared weight. When she handed it back, she didn't say thank you, but she didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any words. Cole stood, heart hammering with a quiet fury, and stared at the chains binding her. They weren't just metal, they were neglect, cruelty, and the collective blindness of a town that forgot to ask who was missing. He knew now that saving her would take more than unlocking a shackle. It would take unraveling whatever nightmare had kept her here. And as he turned toward the stairs to find the keys or break the damn lock himself, he felt her eyes follow him. Not with trust, not yet, but with something harder to earn. The first trace of recognition that he had chosen to see her when no one else would. Chapter 3. Her name was Ella. He lifted her into his arms like lifting a shadow. Her body light not because it lacked weight, but because the weight she carried was buried deeper than skin. Tucked behind every bruise and stitched into every silence she'd swallowed. Her breath was shallow against his chest, uneven like the wind that skipped across the prairie without landing. The basement door groaned as he opened it, sunlight flooding the staircase and spilling onto her face like something holy. She flinched not from pain, but from brightness, as if daylight had become unfamiliar, even hostile. Outside, the town of Dustvale stirred as it always did, with the slow rhythm of a place that had seen too much and decided to see less. But when Cole stepped onto the main street with her in his arms, everything seemed to pause. Horses stopped, their chewing. A boot halted mid-step. The piano inside the saloon fell quiet mid. She wasn't just a woman being carried. She was a question no one had asked, and a truth no one wanted answered. Her head lolled slightly against his shoulder, and as the wind lifted the loose strands of her hair, he could feel how cold her skin remained, even under the rising sun. He walked past the general store, past the sheriff's office, past faces he'd known for years who now looked through him like strangers. Some stared too long. Others turned away, adjusting hats or ducking behind shop windows, as if shame could be buried under groceries and good manners. No one spoke. No one offered help. They simply watched. The world had narrowed to footfalls on dry dirt, a girl with chains on her ankles, and a man who had finally seen what others had chosen not to. They reached the edge of town, where the road turned to field and the houses thinned. His cabin waited there, quiet and modest, with a porch that leaned slightly and a door that never locked unless it had to. He pushed the door open with his boot and carried her to the cot in the corner, where a single quilt lay folded, untouched since winter. He laid her down as gently as a man could, but even then, she flinched, her fingers clutching the air, like they'd forgotten how not to be afraid. He stepped back, breath caught in his chest, watching her chest rise and fall, counting each breath as if afraid one might not come. And then, with a sound so soft it seemed part of the wind, she opened her eyes and looked at him, not past him, not through him, but at him. Her lips parted, cracked and pale. And for a heartbeat he thought she might ask where she was, or who he was, or why the world hadn't ended. But instead, she gave him a name. Ella, she whispered, voice rasped like torn lace, like something broken and still trying to hold shape. Just the Tella, no last name, no past. Just a name that had waited in the dark to be spoken aloud again. And then her body gave out, folding into itself like a paper promise, and she collapsed against the pillow, breath steady, eyes closed, leaving Cole in a room full of dust and silence, and a name that already felt like the beginning of something neither of them were ready to face. Chapter 4: Bandages and Silence. The shack at the edge of town wasn't built for healing. Its roof sagged. Its walls leaned inward like it was trying to hold itself together, but it was quiet, and that mattered more than anything else. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old smoke, and the only sound was the gentle bubbling of a pot of water warming on the stove. Sheriff Cole moved without rush, every motion careful, deliberate, as if touching time itself. He set the tin basin on a small table beside the cot where she lay, and dipped a cloth into the steaming water, wringing it out with calloused hands. She hadn't spoken since giving her name. Not a word, not a murmur. She simply watched him, as one might watch the tide, half in fear, half in wonder. Her skin, where it wasn't bruised or bloodied, was pale like moonlight, stretched to thin across bone, and when he pressed the warm cloth to her cheek, she winced, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes held his like anchors, not desperate, not pleading, just steady, tired, present. He cleaned the cuts along her temple, her collarbone, the jagged rope burns on her wrists. Some wounds had scabbed over long ago, left to fester beneath the dirt. Others were fresh, angry, barely sealed. He said nothing as he worked, and she didn't ask for words. There was something sacred in the silence between them, an unspoken agreement that language was too fragile a bridge for the weight they carried. The room held its breath with them. Dust hung in shafts of fading light, and outside, a raven called once and was gone. When he wrapped her wrist with a length of clean gauze, her fingers twitched as if they remembered being held, but no longer expected it. Still, she did not flinch. The fire crackled low in the corner, offering just enough warmth to hold back the cold, but not enough to feel safe. He moved to her ankles next, pausing at the iron bruises left by chains now gone. They would take time to fade, if they ever did. She watched him the whole while, and though her lips never moved, something shifted in her gaze, a thread of awareness, perhaps, or the tiniest shadow of trust. Not belief, not yet. But the absence of fear, even for a moment, was a gift. And Cole, crouched at the foot of the cot, his hands covered in old blood and warm water, realized that the quiet in the room was no longer empty. It was full of something new, a beginning that neither of them could name, stitched together with steam and cloth and the patience of someone who understood that healing is not loud. It arrives slowly, like morning light slipping through broken shutters, asking nothing except to be let in. Chapter 5: Dustvale doesn't forget. In Dustvale, nothing stays buried. Not really, not the bones beneath the prairie, nor the memories people pretend to misplace. The town itself was stitched together from rumor and rot, its buildings leaning like tired drunks and its roads worn smooth by boots that never stayed long. But the stories, those stayed. They seeped into wood grain and whiskey barrels, into pews and porch steps, and most of all, into people. And so, as Ella began to heal, in the crooked little cabin on the edge of town, the whispers followed. Not loud, never direct, just glances passed like notes between hands. A name spoken with pause, a memory shaken loose from the back of someone's throat. They said she was the preacher's girl, that she used to sit in the front pew with ribbons in her hair and a voice like clear water, that she was good at scripture, always knew when to bow her head and when to look a man in the eye. But the preacher vanished one autumn, rode out one day without saying goodbye, and never returned. Some claimed he'd run off with a widow from Carson's Bluff. Others swore he'd been taken by outlaws, or maybe the Lord himself. What no one said, at least not aloud, was that Ella had been left behind, that the man who once filled the pulpit with fire and judgment had forgotten his own blood. After that, she had drifted, a ghost girl seen sweeping porches that weren't hers, fetching buckets of water from the well before sunrise, always alone, always quiet. Some remembered offering her bread or a blanket. Others remembered looking away. But none of them remembered what happened after she disappeared for good. Until now. Now, she sat on Cole's porch in the afternoons, wrapped in a blanket too large for her shoulders, staring out at nothing with eyes that seemed older than the hills. Her bruises had faded into yellow shadows, and the cuts had closed, but her silence remained, and that silence spoke louder than any sermon Dustvale had ever heard. The townsfolk passed by on their way to market, to church, to the saloon. Some nodded, some crossed the street, a few offered baskets of food or left folded linens at the steps without knocking. Guilt wears many coats, kindness is just one of them. Cole never asked what they remembered. He saw it in their faces, in the way they studied the dirt instead of her, in how they said her name like it might shatter between their teeth. Ella didn't speak of the past either. She listened to the wind, to the fire, to the breath of a town that had once forgotten her. And yet, Dustvale's low, bitter, broken. Dustvale remembered, not the basement, not the chains, but the girl. Before that, the girl in the front pew, the daughter of the man who never came back. And in the hush that followed her return, they all felt it. The weight of a name recalled too late, the ache of a story that had waited in silence, and the uneasy truth that some ghosts don't haunt, they watch. Chapter 6. The Man Who Put Her There. The canyon was where men like Mason Briggs went to hide when the walls of Dustvale grew too narrow for their shadows. It wasn't marked on any map. Not really. It was a scar in the land, cut deep and crooked, where sunlight hesitated and echoes outnumbered voices. Sheriff Cole had ridden the path before, years ago, chasing cattle thieves and drifters who left their sins behind like bootprints in the dust. But this ride felt heavier, slower, as if every hoofbeat carried the weight of someone else's breath. The morning wind was sharp, slicing through the sagebrush and lifting the edges of his coat as he rode. Alone, with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of old leather stretching. In his holster sat a revolver, polished from use, but Cole knew this wasn't that kind of justice. This wasn't about bullets. This was about facing the rot that had taken root under Dustvale's floorboards while the rest of the town chose to sip their whiskey and look away. Mason Briggs had been more than a saloon owner. He'd been a mirror, reflecting the worst parts of Dustvale back at itself. Its silence, its cowardice, its easy forgetfulness. People laughed at his jokes, drank his liquor, played his piano, and all the while, beneath their feet, he kept a girl in chains. Cole didn't know what he'd find at the canyon, only that he wouldn't return empty. The path narrowed into shale and stone, and the horses' hooves cracked loose pebbles that tumbled down the steep walls like tiny avalanches. At a bend in the trail, Cole dismounted, tying the reins to a gnarled tree and continuing on foot, boots crunching against the dry earth. There were no birds here, no voices, just wind and silence, and the faint scent of fire smoke recent, thin, rising from the camp. Mason kept hidden like a wound. Cole spotted them before they saw him. 3 men hunched near the fire, rifles close, expressions dulled by boredom and the safety of distance. But Mason wasn't with them. He sat further off, near the mouth of a cave, cleaning his pistol with the lazy confidence of someone who'd never paid for anything he'd done. Cole stepped into view with no announcement. The men stood, startled, hands drifting toward weapons, but he didn't stop walking. Mason looked up slowly, a grin curling beneath his mustache, not surprised, just amused, as if he'd expected this day to come and had already written the ending. "Cole," he said, like greeting an old card partner. "You come to drink or to bleed?" Cole didn't answer. He just stopped a few paces away and stared, not at the gun, not at the men, but at Mason himself, the man who had let a girl rot beneath laughter and light. And for the first time in a long time, Mason's grin faltered. There was no badge today, no warrant, just the weight of Ella's silence, the echo of her name whispered through the town, and the eyes of a man who had finally decided to carry the weight others dropped. "You're coming with me," Cole said, voice low, steady. One of Mason's men laughed. Cole didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to, because justice, the kind that lives long after blood dries, doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it rides in slow, covered in dust, quiet as a prayer, and looks a man dead in the eye until there's nowhere left to hide. Chapter 7. What Ella Chose. When Mason Briggs was dragged into Dustvale, it wasn't with spectacle, it was with dust. His boots scraped across the dry ground, chains clinking like distant thunder, as 2 deputies flanked him, their faces unreadable. The townspeople didn't gather all at once. They emerged slowly, one by one, like ghosts drawn to the sound of something long buried being unearthed. Children peeked from behind aprons, men stepped out of barber shops with razors still in hand, and women stood with hands pressed to their chests, unsure whether to pray or spit. Mason didn't bow his head. He held it high, jaw clenched, the corner of his mouth twitching in defiance. But there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before, something brittle. Hairline fractures in a man used to winning. They brought him to the center of town, right beneath the old bell tower, and that's where she waited. "Ella," She stood on the porch of the sheriff's cabin, a faded shawl draped over her shoulders like armor, hair pinned back with a care that spoke not of vanity but of readiness. Her face was pale in the noon light, but steady, unmoved. She didn't look at the chains. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at him. Mason paused when he saw her, and for the briefest moment, the street held its breath. Everyone expected something, a scream, a slap, a rush of words hot with fury. But Ella gave them none of that. She stepped forward, slow and sure, the wooden planks beneath her feet creaking like tired memory, and when she reached the edge of the steps, she spoke not loudly, not trembling, but with a quiet that cut deeper than any shout. "Let them see you now," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, like a curtain being pulled back. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through every face turned toward her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She had chosen something heavier than vengeance, dignity. Mason opened his mouth, but no words came. For once, the saloon keeper, who always had something to say, some crooked charm, stood speechless. And in that silence, Dustvale remembered its shame. Not just Mason's crimes, but their own silence, their own comfort, their own part in letting a girl vanish beneath their floorboards. The deputies didn't move. They didn't need to. The trial would come, and the cell would lock. But Ella had already delivered the real sentence. Not with a gavel, not with a fist, but with the strength to stand tall and say nothing more than the truth. She turned and walked back inside, the screen door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud, and the town stayed still a little longer, as if unsure how to move forward in a place where a woman like Ella now stood in the light, unshaken. Mason, for the first time in his life, looked small, not because of the chains on his wrists, but because of the weight of a gaze he could never escape. A gaze that had once looked up at him from the dark, and now looked down on him from the steps of justice he never believed he'd faced. And in that moment, he understood what Dustvale had come to learn. Too late. There is nothing more powerful than a woman who survived quietly and chose not to burn the world down, even though she had every reason to. Chapter 8. The Saloon Burns. They say it started just after midnight, when the wind died down and the moon hung low like a lidless eye, watching over Dustvale's scenes. Some claimed it was an accident, a tipped lantern, a drunk hand, a spark too close to the curtains. Others whispered different stories, that a woman in a gray shawl had been seen walking alone down Main Street, her steps steady, her eyes forward, that she paused in front of the saloon without touching the door, without flinching at the broken piano, still echoing in memory, that she held a single match between her fingers like a prayer or a judgment. The truth, as always in Dustvale, was swallowed by smoke, but what is certain is this: the saloon caught fire that night, and by morning there was nothing left but black bones and ash. The flames moved fast, hungry, as if fed not by wood but by memory. Glass shattered in sharp gasps. The windows screamed with heat. The roof collapsed in a groan like a final breath. And still, no one moved to stop it. Townsfolk stood at a distance, roused from sleep, barefoot in nightshirts, their eyes reflecting the orange glow. The sheriff stood among them, hat low, arms crossed, saying nothing, because deep down, even those who didn't know how it started knew exactly why it had to end. Inside those walls had been laughter, yes, and drink, and card games, but also pain soaked deep into the floorboards, into the air itself. Ella had once lived beneath that building, unseen, and now she watched it disappear into flame. They said she didn't blink, that she stood by the edge of the boardwalk with the wind catching the hem of her dress, the fire painting her face in golden shadow, and simply stared. Not with rage, not with joy, but with stillness, as if witnessing a funeral long overdue. The smoke curled into the sky like words unsaid, and in it, the town saw everything they had chosen to ignore: the missing girl, the silence in the floor, the laughter that echoed too loud. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out. Only embers remained, glowing like old eyes in the rubble. Children crept out at first light to kick at the charred debris, to marvel at what had been destroyed, but no one touched the blackened threshold. No one dared. Ella was not seen that morning. Her door remained closed, her windows drawn, but her absence said more than her presence ever could. The saloon was gone, the past reduced to ash, and in the clearing smoke, Dustvale began to breathe differently. No longer holding its breath, no longer pretending it had forgotten, The building that had once stood tall above the town now lay broken and buried, just like the girl it once tried to keep hidden. Only she had risen. Only she remained. And the town, for the first time, began to understand that healing doesn't come with revenge or verdicts. Sometimes it comes with flame, quiet, slow, cleansing, and final. Chapter 9. The Woman She Became. By the time spring softened the hard edges of Dustvale, the woman once carried from the shadows had begun to walk on her own, slow at first. Each step a small defiance, a quiet refusal to disappear again. Ella no longer avoided the sunlight. She walked beneath it with her shoulders square and her chin lifted, not in arrogance but in certainty. The bruises that once darkened her skin had faded into memory, and the silence that clung to her like a second skin had slipped away, not with noise but with purpose. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. She no longer belonged to the margins of Dustvale. She had become a part of its rhythm, its morning market, its afternoon hush, its evening stillness. And yet, she did not return to the chapel where she once sat with ribboned hair, nor did she ever pass the place where the saloon once stood, though little remained now but scorched earth and a few blackened nails curled like dead insects. Instead, she found a single-room building near the edge of the square, an abandoned storeroom with broken windows and a door that groaned like old bones. She swept it out herself, mended the glass, painted the walls in soft colors no one could quite name, and filled its shelves with books donated in quiet bundles left at her step. No sign hung above the door, no name marked its purpose, but children came first, the girls, shy and uncertain, then the boys, curious and suspicious. She taught them to read, to write, to think without shame, and speak without fear. She read them stories of other places and other lives, of wrongs made right and truths uncovered, and never once did she speak of her own. She didn't need to. Her presence was its own story, unfolding day by day in pages of patience and quiet strength. Mothers began to nod to her as they passed. Fathers tipped their hats without words. Even the preacher's widow brought her honey and a smile. Though the smile trembled, Ella accepted them all without judgment, as if she understood the weight of being late to kindness. She wore no rings, spoke no vows, made no promises. But she became something sacred to the town, an emblem, not of what had been taken, but of what could be reclaimed. And though she never said it aloud, she carried herself like someone who had died once down there, in that basement, and chosen, somehow, to come back different, not harder, not colder, but clearer, as if the darkness had burned everything that wasn't hers, and left behind only what was true. And so she walked the streets of Dustvale in silence, not because she feared speaking, but because the town, now, was learning to listen. Chapter 10. Ella of Dustvale. Years later, when the saloon had long been swallowed by grass, and the whispers had settled into the roots of Dustvale like old rain, they still spoke of her, not in hushed tones, not in pity, but with the reverence reserved for those who change a place by simply remaining. Children who once sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of her reading room now stood taller than the porch beams, their voices carrying confidence shaped by quiet afternoons with Ella. The sheriff, long since grayed and slowed, walked a little straighter when her name was spoken, as if it belonged to a truth deeper than law. And though no plaque marked the place where it all began, no monument to a girl once chained beneath laughter, Dustvale remembered. They remembered the man who heard what others ignored, and the woman who emerged from silence, not with vengeance, but with a steadiness that made the town lean toward her like sunflowers to light. Her name was etched not into stone, but into practice. In the way the teacher at the school paused for listening, in how the shopkeeper offered change with both hands, in how the preacher no longer filled silence with noise but allowed it to speak for itself. Ella lived in a small house near the chapel but never stepped inside its doors. Her faith was not found in sermons, but in stories read aloud each week to any who gathered on her porch. From fairy tales to ancient fables to the words of women long gone, no one asked her to explain. No one dared to call her survivor or saint. She had become something quieter than legend, more enduring than memory. She was the weight in every pause before cruelty, the stillness before apology, the choice to speak gently when the world turned harsh. When she passed, many years later, her funeral drew no procession, no great eulogy, just a long line of people carrying books under their arms, voices softened by something they could not name. The children now grown read aloud that day, each one choosing a passage she had once given them, and the town listened, as it had learned to do. Dustvale, once built on dust and drink, and the brittle backs of forgotten girls, now stood on something else, something stitched together not with wood or nails, but with words and patience, and the echo of a single whisper heard beneath the floorboards. Ella was gone, but never absent. Her presence lingered in the corners of the reading room, in the worn pages of donated books, in the porch boards that creaked under eager feet. And so the town carried her forward, not in stories of what was done to her, but in stories of what she did next. And though the prairie winds still howled and the winters still came hard, Dustvale no longer forgot its daughters, because one of them had reminded them all how to remember.